Good.
Good evening. I'm happy to be with all of you again to discuss some more ideas about music and music making. This month, I wanted to share with you briefly some ideas about what many know as music theory. Now, for many musicians, particularly those who focus their energy on performing, the study of music theory is one of the most dreaded parts of musical training, which in itself is a gauntlet, particularly if you have professional aspirations. The quote you saw at the beginning was from Ferruccio Busoni's sketch for A New Aesthetic for Music. It was a brief essay he wrote, not only to clarify his ideas about how music was being written at that time, but he also wrote it to challenge and create dialogue with his contemporaries about how music was being performed and interpreted. Much theoretical study in the Western musical system, in the Western sort of classical tradition, focuses on either compositional or analytical exercises, which for me is learning how to make meals from some sort of arcane tome, like a medieval cookbook, if you want to call it that. So, in order to do that, you have to first get familiar with the ingredients. So, first, you have keys and tempo and rhythm and dynamics, and they are never static. Sometimes they are, but they change and they move in gradations. Next, you have the melodies or the material that make up the melodies. Whether it's if this is half of the phrase and then the other half of the phrase, or maybe it's one big long phrase. After that, you have motifs, particularly in the Baroque through the Romantic era. You have motifs, certain musical figures that might either just be pieces that the composer will feature and use over and over again, or musical features that actually signify something rhetorically or in terms of a character or a mood. Then you have harmonic structure, some of its large harmonic structure over the course of an entire movement or over the course of an entire long, great masterwork. And even on a sort of more micro level, what's the harmonic rhythm? How fast or slow does the harmony shift? After that, there are tons of diacritical and articulatory markings in the score, in the music. And there's always a question about whether those are the composers or whether those are the editors. Are these present in the composer's manuscript and the or text, or are they added in later by another source to possibly clarify the style or the performance practices or traditions of the piece? So right here we have the first 2 pages of the full score of one of the most recognizable symphonies in Western concert music, Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. Moving forward, we will hear the same music thrice, three different ways by 3 different great interpreters of a symphonic music. The first will be Daniel Barenboim with the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. The following one will be by Pavel Järvi, and after that we'll hear Leonard Bernstein. You'll hear again the same 20 to 30 second section from the very beginning of this symphony, but you'll hear it in very different ways because their interpretation of these same notes is so different. Let's hear it. So, as Busoni noted, and as you just heard, the signs actually, the notes, the markings on the page don't actually contain all of the information. They don't contain the spirit of the piece, but they give you sort of a foggy, cloudy window into the piece. So, in order to create a fully thought out, inspired, and informed interpretation, relying on only the notes on the page is like doing paint by numbers with only half of the colors required and a bunch of broken brushes. So, what you have to examine is, therefore, what's not on the page. If the story is not in the notes themselves, but intentionally suggested by them through the sound and through the sounds they guide us to make, what are the clues? Where can we search for the clues into what the composer was thinking? Well, first off, we have to do some study beyond that. We have to look into possibly the visual art of the time of the composition. What type of pictures, paintings, what was the visual environment? What was the composer seeing? And what were artists representing in the art of that time? What were the literary traditions that both preceded and were happening at the same time that the composer wrote the piece? What other pieces, how did the composer write throughout their entire body of work, both before and after? If you examine a wide stretch of the composer's oeuvre, you can start to see certain compositional patterns, certain figures, certain things that they do that's idiosyncratically them. And so you start to look at those things and see similarities throughout their entire body of work within one piece that gives you even more of a clue. You can also examine the stylistic conventions and traditions of that time. So if you were looking at particular musical figures or musical material or certain relationships between harmonic shifts, and that they tend to happen stylistically, not just with with that composer, but with other composers at the same time. It gives you a sort of a deeper sense of why the composer would use those same features or might choose to deviate from those features. The other piece, which is grand, is a societal historical context. What was going on politically then? What was going on in terms of who was ruling who? What wars were being fought? Were people migrating from one area of the world to to another? Were there power shifts? Were there aesthetic arguments between composers and artists and thinkers of the time? Were there literary movements that died off and then other people reacted to them? All of these bits give a complete, more total picture of what the composer was thinking of and seeing, and they give us a sense of the environment. So we can then perhaps discover why the composer, as a living, breathing artist, would choose to arrange the signs, the notes, and therefore the sounds we're supposed to make in the way they appear on the score. After that, we think about performance history. When was the first performance? What was the premiere? And then what traditions after that have existed with that piece? Because they then can inform us as to how we might want to or want not to perform the piece. Let's examine another quote by Busoni. There are some other, before I get to that, there are some other features to explore thinking of those things. We have the proper execution of written ornaments. This particularly deals with grace notes, appoggiatura, mordents, trills, those sort of things, and how those are marked and how those are executed depend on the time period. It's different in the Baroque as it is in the Classical, and some of those things are very different when you get to the Romantic period. So a Mozartean or Mozartean, depending on how you want to pronounce it, grace note or appoggiatura would be performed slightly differently than one that Schubert wrote. A turn in Schubert might be different than a turn in Bach. Very very fine, I guess you want to call it esoteric knowledge, but it does contribute to how you make the sound. Particularly in the 1700s and 1800s, particular keys had rhetorical and affective significance, as well as if you chose one key and how it related to the next key. You know, within keys, every major key has a relative minor key, and usually those were seen as pretty adjacent. You could switch back and forth. But then there were certain composers, Haydn definitely, Mozart, but then in the Romantic period, where you would choose a parallel key. So you might have, which is, if you were in D major, you might do a sudden shift to D minor, which wouldn't have the same key signature, but it would give you the flip side of that key. Speaking of D major, if you want to talk about affective significance, there's a reason why, you might see, there's a reason why Hallelujah, the Hallelujah chorus is written in D major, because it is a triumphant key. It has that affect, and Handel and Bach and all those composers would have known and been aware of the significance of these keys, and they would be using that as part of the rhetorical backup for why they wrote music in those particular tonalities. Going back to this, there also a recognition, you would recognize musical patterns and recurring themes so that they would be able to guide not only your eyes through the score, but your ears through the score. And the same thing for the audience. Some of them, when you're thinking about Wagner, whom we talked about in last month's lecture, he was, basically the king of writing the leitmotif. The entirety of his Ring, the four operas, the Ring of the Nibelung, are littered. It's completely constructed of different motifs that signify different things: characters, actions, objects, moods. There's a love motif, there's a spear motif, there's a Valkyrie motif, there's a motif for, the horses, or actually not the horses, the rams that pull the chariot of the Queen of the Gods. So all of these things add up to a larger, wide picture when you look through the entire piece. I mean, and you're talking about 4 large pieces, not just one. And now for that extra quote from Ferruccio Busoni for us to consider. So, we should be thinking, when you're thinking about the fact that the piece exists sort of on its own, it exists kind of in this philosophically, in I don't know whether you want to call it dimensional limbo or in the ether, because it exists as an idea. When we render a piece and we infuse our living selves into it and then render it, there are a couple things that obviously we should do. Let's talk about what we should not do first. At least, and this again are my takeaways from it. We should never limit ourselves to being the mere, what I like to call pitch and sound machines. We're not supposed to just put the pitches. We're not just supposed to put the pitches and the words and the notes at the right time. That's a big part of that. But if we only do that, we're actually not doing the piece. We could program a computer to do that. There is one big caveat in the fact that there are, especially in the 20th century and in modern music particularly, where the composer has constructed that as a type of experience, so that rather than there are composers, where Poulenc is one of them, where he'll say something like sans nuance, without nuances. There'll be some composers that'll say deadpan. So they part of the experience that they want to craft for the audience and for the performers to experience is one where there actually is no emotion, and that it actually is very, if you want to call it, robotic. That there is this very dry, only the sounds and the pitches, and sometimes those composers actually don't have words, but they have phonemes, so syllables that you use um, to just produce kind of an aural array, a soundscape, if you want to call it that. While we need to use our expressive impulses to imbue the piece with life, we can't overindulge them, because if we do overindulge them, we risk distorting the sound picture that the composer has crafted for us and for the audience to experience. So we need to be expressive but not go overboard. And I think we all, it's almost, when you think about the realm of ideas, it I think we all get a sense of when the music is being bent away from recognizability. That said, there are things that we should, and I would venture to say must do. We first must seek to understand the composer as a creative person. These these great, I think of the word genius as in its original sense. That genius, when someone, they didn't say someone was a genius, they would say someone had genius, touched by the genial or the genial, that the genius, the spirit touched them and came through them, and that's why these great masterworks happen. But I think, but at the end of the day, they were all people. And so the more we can understand them as creative people and not sort of these mythical beasts, the more we give ourselves not license, but we allow ourselves to meet them and to think about the pieces that they made as pieces of process. That there's a process by which they wrote them. And so by trying to examine their process and what might have influenced that process, we get a sense of who they were and how they sought to interpret, especially as singers, how they sought to interpret the text and render the text in enhanced sound for us and for an audience to experience. When we do this study, we actually create a dialogue, and I've always been somebody who believes that that the study of music theory, and by understanding what the notes and the accidentals and the figures and the chords all are, the main purpose of studying them is not just to, be able to call something by a name, but it's actually to be able to dialogue with these, creative personalities. It's kind of an oral anthropology or archaeology, if you want to call it that. I feel every time I analyze a score, I feel like I'm doing some sort of dig, that I'm trying to find what's under all of that, so that then I can more fully understand their intent, knowing that unless I, develop some gifts to call their spirit up and talk to talk to it directly, I'll always be doing really great guesswork. And to some extent, there are letters, there are, many composers did write, Mahler especially, Mozart wrote letters, Beethoven wrote letters. They do have thoughts that they've written down about their lives, and sometimes they have thoughts they wrote down about their pieces. Mahler wrote tons and tons and tons of notes and critical notes about how he wanted something done, and then he would change it. And he was changing his markings in his score in his scores until he died, and he was constantly revising them. And so I think that as if we're continuing that tradition, particularly in Mahler's case, we would be examining his scores the same way. And so there is this sense that every time we come up to a score, no matter how well known it is or how iconic it is, we're still creating a shared experience, not just from the composer who may be long gone. Some composers are currently living, and we can call them up and ask them or write them a letter or an email. But we're still it's a shared experience between us and dialogue and composer, and then of course with the audience that's hearing the sound as it's being generated by the performers. And most importantly, we actually need to be deliberate about using our own lived experience as the fuel for our performance. I can't I can't even tell you how many times when I'm working with young musicians or with ensembles where I feel as a conductor, I almost always, even if working with the same ensemble, whether they're professionals or if you professionals are amateur or community based or whatever, that I have to almost as a conductor give permission to say, there's something in your own life that you can relate to this. And just because we're all in a room with a bunch of us and all of us have different experiences, we can all be making the same sounds, meaning the same notes at the same time, and be relating to them in different ways. And that's okay. That's the beauty of what making music together, of collaboratively creating sonic experiences. That's what is the beautiful thing about music making, is that we could all be resonating and producing the same frequencies, and yet behind all of that are so many different lived experiences, and that is what brings it to life. On the other side, when we do that, we actually invite the audience to bring themselves more fully into the listening experience of a performance, and that we open the door for them to experience the music in whatever way they need to, and they feel that they have to. So there is this shared, lived, and built experience as the music is happening, that if we don't give ourselves that full permission to engage in, we are robbing ourselves of that opportunity. And so, thinking about that, I could have, delved into it more, and pulled up some staves and built some, examples, but that would be scratching the surface. There's so much to music theory, that there's so much to music theory and so much learning in that, that to try to, even start delving into that, it would be like it would be like teaching basic algebra in a lecture, which would be a course in and of itself. And this lecture would have ended up being 2 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours long if I really wanted to delve it, if I really tried to go there. I just wanted to give you a real sense, and a beginning sense, an introductory sense to how using theoretical study and score study and that knowledge allows a performer and an interpreter to delve in and go beyond just producing the notes, so that the making of music and that the performance of music becomes this whole experience, and that it constantly changes and that it constantly lives within us and within the hearts of the audiences that we seek to serve and the communities that we seek to serve. So until our next Q&A this month, save your questions, and I look forward to dialoguing with you about the thoughts that I've expressed in this lecture. Until then, keep hoping, keep studying, definitely after this video, keep searching, and of course, keep singing. My love to all of you.